Welcome YouTubers to another episode in my Grammar Heroes series. In today's video, we're going to be discussing the midpoint formula, which has a very high likelihood of appearing in the mathematics knowledge subtest of the Armed Services Vocational Aptitude Battery, that is the ASVAB. The midpoint formula, as you can see, is used to find the exact center point between two defined points in a line segment. More specifically, a midpoint is an ordered pair, and it's found using the formula x1 plus x2 divided by 2 for the x value in the ordered pair, and y1 plus y2 divided by 2 for the y value in the ordered pair. So far, I've talked about writing equations for lines in my videos. The key difference between the midpoint and writing an equation of a line is the fact that in order to find the midpoint, you need to have a line segment. That is, you need to have a line that has two clearly defined endpoints. If you take a look right here, you can see that's one endpoint, that's the other endpoint, and that would be the midpoint. Similarly, I also want to point out that whereas lowercase m is used to find the slope, wherever you see an uppercase M, that refers to the midpoint. Okay? Now, the only other thing you need to know to find the midpoint of a line segment is this. You need to know what your x1, y1, and x2, y2 values are to plug them into the midpoint formula. Those are simply either given to you or you can find them on a graph. For example, this endpoint on the left we can call x1, y1, and this endpoint on the right we can call x2, y2. As far as today's video goes, I want to cover three things in greater detail. First, I want to show you how to find the midpoint from a graph. Next, I want to show you how to find the midpoint given two endpoints. And then finally, I want to show you how to find the midpoint from an endpoint as well as the midpoint. Of all the things we're going to talk about today, number 3 is going to be the most challenging. That said, once we do a few problems, you should see that it's pretty straightforward. And again, either of these three things may appear on the ASVAB. So all that said, let's get started with today's video. Question 1 says find the midpoint of each line segment. The first thing to find the midpoint is to go ahead and label your endpoints. So we have an endpoint here as well as here. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and write down its ordered pair. We can see that this one is -1, 2, 3, 4, 5 for its x value, and -1, 2, 3, 4, 5 for its y value. So this endpoint, in other words, has an ordered pair -5, -5. And this endpoint, as we can see, is -1, -1. And since we're here, let's go ahead and assign values to our x1, y1, as well as x2, y2. In general, it's a good idea to label the point that's farthest to the left on the graph as your x1, y1, and the other one as x2, y2. So I'm going to call this one x1, y1, and similarly this one x2, y2. Let's go ahead and write down the midpoint formula. Again, it's big M equals x1 plus x2 divided by 2, y1 plus y2 divided by 2. Let's plug things in accordingly since we already labeled everything on the graph. X1 we said was -5 plus x2 is -1. Again, that's all divided by 2. Y1 we said was -5. Y2 we can see is going to be -1. Again, that's all divided by 2. Let's go ahead and work this out. Negative 5 plus negative 1 is negative 6 divided by 2. Negative 5 plus negative 1 is negative 6 divided by 2. Reducing this further, we can see negative 6 divided by 2 is simply negative 3. So, in other words, the midpoint of this line segment is at the point negative 3, 3. If we want to put that on this graph, we can to check the reasonableness of our answer. Negative 1, 2, 3, negative 1, 2, 3. We can see that our midpoint does in fact bisect the two endpoints directly in the center of those two endpoints. So that's that one. Let's go ahead and do a few more just so we can get it down. Let's go ahead and do number 2. Again, the first step is to go ahead and label your endpoints. That is to write down their ordered pairs and then assign x1, y1, x2, y2 accordingly. So we'll start with this endpoint. We can see it's at negative 5, 5. So negative 5, 5. And since it's the farthest to the left, let's call it x1, y1 while we're there. And then this endpoint right here, as we can see, is 2, negative 5. And let's go ahead and call this conversely x2, y2. Let's write down our midpoint formula. Again, that's m, big M, equals x1 plus x2 divided by 2. Y1 plus y2 divided by 2. Plug things in and then solve accordingly. X1 we said was negative 5 plus x2 is positive 2. That's all divided by 2. Y1 we said was positive 5 plus y2, we can see that's negative 5. Again, that's all divided by 2. Let's keep working this out. Negative 5 plus 2 is negative 3. Again, that's over 2. 5 plus negative 5 is 0 over 2. And if we keep working this out, we can see that negative 3 over 2 is reduced, so we can leave it like that. And 0 divided by 2 is just 0. In other words, this midpoint is going to be at the x value negative 1.5 or negative 3 over 2. And the y value is 0. Let's go ahead and graph that to check our answer. Again, x value is negative 1.5, which is right there, and the y value is 0. So we can see that our midpoint does in fact sit directly in the center of these two endpoints. Okay. Let's do one more just to make sure we have it. Again, the first step in the process is to label your endpoints. And again, we'll start with this one on the left-hand side. That endpoint is going to be negative 1, 2, 3, 4 for the x value, positive 2 for the y value. And since we're here, let's call this x1, y1. Now let's label the other endpoint. That's going to be positive 2 for the x value, positive 2 for the y value. And again, that's x2, y2. Let's write down our midpoint formula. Again, that's x1 plus x2 divided by 2, y1 plus y2 divided by 2. We've already labeled everything, so this is going to be pretty easy to plug in and solve for. X1 is negative 4. X2 is 2. Again, that's all divided by 2 according to the formula. Y1 is 2. Y2 is also 2. It's all divided by 2, as we can see. Let's go ahead and reduce this. Negative 4 plus 2 is negative 2. Again, that's all divided by 2. 2 plus 2 is 4. Again, that's divided by 2. Let's go ahead and keep reducing this. Negative 2 divided by 2 is negative 1. 4 divided by 2 is 2. And therefore, our midpoint in this case is going to be negative 1, 2. Let's go ahead and plot that on our graph to check the reasonableness of our answer. X value is negative 1, whereas the Y value is 2. So we're going to go negative 1, 1, 2. And as we can see, our midpoint that we came up with does ostensibly appear to be directly in the center of these two endpoints. Okay, so that's that. Pretty straightforward. So let's move on to a few different types of problems. Now, in the first few problems, we were given a graph and we had to come up with the midpoint. For these next few problems, we're going to be given the endpoints with no graph, and we're just going to be asked to find the midpoint from them. So let's go ahead and do that. Again, it's the same process. Just label your x1, y1, x2, y2 before you get started. I'm going to call this one x1, y1, x2, y2. And again, let's go ahead and write down the midpoint formula. That's m equals x1 plus x2 over 2, y1 plus y2 over 2. Let's go ahead and plug things in accordingly and then solve. X1 is negative 4. X2 is 5. Again, that's over 2. Our y1 is 4. Our y2 is negative 1. Again, that's all over 2. Negative 4 plus 5 is just 1. Again, that's over 2. 4 plus negative 1, that's going to be 3. And again, that's over 2. So the midpoint of these endpoints is at the location 1/2, 3 over 2. Okay, so that was that one. Let's go ahead and do number 10 now. Again, let's start by labeling our x1, y1, x2, y2 accordingly. x1, y1, x2, y2. Jot down the midpoint formula. Again, that's the ordered pair x1 plus x2 divided by 2, comma, y1 plus y2 divided by 2. Plug things in since we already labeled everything. X1, as we can see, is negative 1 plus x2, which is negative 6. And that's all divided by 2. Y1 is negative 6 plus y2 is 5. Again, that's all divided by 2. Let's go ahead and solve. Negative 1 plus negative 6 is negative 7. Again, that's going to be over 2. And negative 6 plus 5 is negative 1. And again, that's over 2. In other words, the midpoint of these two endpoints is at the location negative 7 divided by 2, as well negative 7 divided by 2, 1/2. Okay, so that's all you do when you're given two ordered pairs. You label your x1, y1 accordingly, plug it into the midpoint formula, and solve. So finally, let's talk about another type of problem you may see on the ASVAB. That is, you're going to be asked to find one endpoint when you're given only one endpoint as well as a midpoint. So let's take a look at number 21. 21 says, find the other endpoint of the line segment with the given endpoint and midpoint. Okay, and we have the endpoint negative 1, 9, and the midpoint negative 9, negative 10. So we're still going to be using, not surprisingly, the midpoint formula. But that said, we're going to have to figure out what we're going to do to find the other ordered pair for this other endpoint. So let's jot down the midpoint formula to get started. Again, it's x1 plus x2 divided by 2, and it's y1 plus y2. Again, that's divided by 2. Let's go ahead and label the one endpoint that we're given x1, y1. And now let's go ahead and think about what we're doing. Again, we know what x1 is, and I'm going to drop down. I'm going to take away this bracket because I want to do some algebra here for a second. Let's focus instead on this, the x value of this ordered pair. We know what x1 is. It's -1. We don't know what x2 is, so let's leave that as x2 divided by 2. We know that this -1 plus x2 divided by 2 has to give you this x value in the midpoint formula. So we know that, in other words, this is going to equal to -9. And now we can simply solve for x2. And how can we do that? First, we're going to clear 2 from the denominator by multiplying both sides by 2. That will cancel these out. That will leave us with -1 plus x2 equals -9 times 2, which is -18. Let's add 1 to both sides. This crosses out, leaves us with x2 equals -18 plus 1, which is -17. So in other words, we're trying to find our other endpoint, which is going to be x2, y2. And we just found our x2. It's -17. So we're halfway there. Now we're just going to do the same thing to find our y value. Again, we're going to drop the brackets for a second so we can do the algebra. Our y1, if you remember, we labeled as 9. So let's plug that in for y1. We have 9 plus y2 divided by 2 equals, and again, this is going to be the y value in our midpoint formula. It's going to have to equal -10. Okay. Like over here, let's clear 2 from the denominator by multiplying both sides by 2. This clears it. We're left with 9 plus y2. Let me rewrite that. Equals -10 times 2, which is -20. Let's get y2 by itself by subtracting 9 from both sides. This crosses out. We're left with y2 equals -20 minus 9 is -29. And therefore, we found the y2 value in our second endpoint, namely -29. Okay, so as you can see, using the midpoint formula, as well as one endpoint and the midpoint, we can find the other endpoint pretty easily. But that said, let's do another one to make sure we understand the concept. And we'll go ahead and erase this real quick. Number 22, we have the same instructions. It says find the other endpoint of the line segment with the given endpoint and midpoint. To start, I'm going to go ahead and label what I have. Namely, I have one endpoint, which I'm going to call x1, y1, and the midpoint. So using the midpoint formula, we can go ahead and find the other endpoint. Again, the midpoint formula is x1 plus x2 divided by 2, y2, not y2, y1 plus y2 divided by 2. In this case, we're going to solve for x2 and y2. We have to realize that we can set the x values equal to this x value in the midpoint and these y values to this y value in the midpoint, and that will help us solve for x2 and y2. So let's go ahead and see what that looks like. Again, we would have x, if we pull this out, we would have x1 plus x2 divided by 2 equals the value, the x value of this midpoint. So let's call this xm and ym if we want to. xm. Let's plug things in accordingly. X1 we've already identified, it's 2, plus x2 divided by 2, and xm, referring to the x value in the midpoint, is going to be 5. Now all we have to do to solve this one is to solve for x2, and we can do so by first multiplying both sides by 2, which will clear 2 from the denominator. This crosses out and leaves us with 2 plus x2 equals 5 times 2, which is 10. Subtracting 2 from both sides gives us x2 equals 10 minus 2, which is 8. So in other words, again, we're trying to find the x2, y2 values in the other endpoint. We just found the x2 value, which is 8. Now we just have to find the y2 value. Again, if we pull this out, we have y1 plus y2 divided by 2 is going to equal y to the m, which refers to the y value in the midpoint. Let's plug in what we have and solve for what we need. Y1 is 5 plus y2. Again, y2 is what we're trying to solve for, so we're going to leave that as is. The midpoint and the y in the midpoint is 1. And again, this is divided by 2. So to start, we're going to clear 2 from the denominator by multiplying both sides by 2. That clears it, of course. That leaves us with 5 plus y2 equals 1 times 2, which is 2. To get y2 by itself, we can subtract 5 from both sides. That crosses out and leaves us with y2 equals 2 minus 5, which is negative 3. Let's plug that y2 value in our other endpoint. So as we can see, given this endpoint and this midpoint, the location of the other endpoint is going to be 8, negative 3. Okay, so with a little bit of algebra, you can go ahead and solve these types of problems. All that said, that's all I have for you in this video. As always, I appreciate any feedback you leave in the comments section below. Again, on the ASVAB, you're going to have to deal with the midpoint in one of 3 ways. You're going to have to find the midpoint from a graph, the midpoint from 2 endpoints, or the midpoint given an endpoint and its midpoint, all of which I covered in this video. If you want more content like this, please consider subscribing to my channel. If you look in the community tab of my channel, you can see I've posted a list of topics I anticipate covering over the next week or 2, all of which is a good review for the ASVAB. That said, on that note, I'm going to go ahead and cut you loose. Konnichiwa.